All right, welcome to my channel. My name is Miguel Benitez, and I'm in a relentless pursuit of goodness, truth, and beauty. And my channel invites you to join me in that journey. So today I have a special guest with me, Carolyn Leiloglou. And she is an author, and I'm really excited to have this discussion with her today. A little bit more about Carolyn. She's the granddaughter of art collectors, daughter of an art teacher, and homeschooling mom to 4 wildly creative kids. She's the award-winning author of the middle grade fantasy trilogy, The Restorationists, which we'll be talking about more today. Book 1 of the series, Beneath the Swirling Sky, received a 2024 SELA Award and was a finalist for the ECPA Christian Book Award. Carolyn makes her home in San Antonio, Texas, and you can find her everywhere online at House Full of Bookworms. So, Carolyn, thank you for taking the time to join me for this conversation.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background as to how I came across your book initially. So we, and I'm sad to say, we actually found the show of the Wing Feather Saga before I ever knew it was a book. So we all watched it and loved it. And then I found out it was a book. I'm big on reading books before you watch the shows and the movies, but but anyway, so I wanted to find more of those kinds of things. So we're homeschool parents as well. I have a 9-year-old Alex and a 6-year-old Gabby, and so they loved it. And so I wanted to find more along that line, fantasy, aimed at that age group, and so yours, along with the Green Ember series, were the ones that kind of popped up. So we haven't read the Green Ember series yet, but yours was the first. And then, kind of coincidentally, we were visiting my brother-in-law in Orlando, and his daughter Madeline, who is 11, had just finished the book 1 of the Restorationists series. And so,
amazing.
and my son was like halfway through it. And then my brother-in-law, who's just a few years older than me, he tells me, you should really read this book. He's like, I think you'd love it, knowing that I'm a professor of humanities and I love to talk about art. And so my son was really liking it. And I'm like, it'd be a great way to just have conversations with him anyway. And so I started reading it and just couldn't put it down. I loved it. So, but yeah, for our audience, am I right in saying the target audience would be that 8-year-old to 12-year-old range? Is that right?
Yeah, so that's the traditional like middle grade target. I will say like a lot of the beta readers I had were my daughter's friends, so they're all in the, 16 to 20-year-old range, and have kind of been my biggest cheerleaders in a way. So I know that it reads up as well. I've had a lot of parents tell me that. So I mean, that's my hope. Is I started out in picture book writing, and in picture book writing, you have that dual audience of the parent and the child, and it really has to be for both. So I think I've kind of carried that with me into writing for middle grade readers.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's the way that I see it. I really do see it as a book that is accessible and can be read by my son. Alex is the one that read it and loved it, and he's 9, so he's kind of on the bottom end of that group. And then my niece, who's 11, also loved it, but then my brother-in-law and I both ended up really loving it. And I love that C.S. Lewis quote where he wrote a letter to his niece, right, and says that one day you'll be old enough to read fairy tales again, right? And so it's that idea that maybe even if a kid kind of ages out of this age range, there'll be a time in which they can come back and appreciate it either way, I think. So yeah. So with that, I did let my kids and my niece know that I was interviewing you, which they thought were so cool. You're a celebrity in our home. And so I did give them the opportunity to submit a question. So I'll kind of fit them in where I think it's appropriate. So I'll start with my son's question first because it's the most broad one.
Okay.
So he says this. He says, I have a hard time thinking of stories. We make him write stories for school. So, and he says, do you have any suggestions about how I can go about coming up with stories?
That's interesting. Okay. So the thing about stories and story ideas is the more you try to generate ideas, the more ideas you get. It's not like this well that you can pull up all the water from and it runs dry at some point. It's like a stream, right? It's going by. And the better you get at catching the water from that stream, the easier it is. So that's what I find is the more I'm actually trying, like if I make myself like, okay, let's think of 10 title ideas or 10 story ideas for a picture book or 10 whatever, I'm inevitably going to come up with some better ones, and it's going to get easier. So I would say, number one, it gets easier the more you try to do it. And number two, sometimes you just have to combine different things that you wouldn't have thought combining before. So, for instance, I guess with the Restorationists, you could say combining art with, there's a lot of books where people travel into books or characters come out of books. So I'm combining the idea of art with that same idea of being able to travel into a story, but instead it's a painting. So I'd say combining two things that you hadn't seen before is another good way to come up with an idea.
That's great. I like the idea of art as combination, because in a sense, being that we are made in God's image and we are reflecting that image as creators, as sub-creators, because he's the ultimate creator, we create by combining the things in which God has already made, right? And so it's just kind of one of the ways in which we as humans make art. So that's great. I think he'll really appreciate that answer. And then my niece Madeline wanted to know, who's your favorite artist?
Well, that's probably not too hard to guess for anyone who's read the book. So you can see the cover over here, the blue one.
I've got it here with me.
So Van Gogh's The Starry Night is kind of featured prominently. Van Gogh's definitely my favorite. I just love his art, and it's so moving and emotive. And it was just kind of the perfect starting place for, if you're jumping into a painting, why not pick a painting that already kind of feels like it's moving? It just kind of came to life really easily that way. So
yeah. That's excellent. So I didn't plan on asking this till later, but it kind of flows with where we're going here. So I'll just go ahead and throw out my daughter's question to you. She's 6, and she said, how did you come up with the idea of being able to enter into paintings? And that in itself, and we'll share with the audience a little more about the story here in a minute. That way they know what they're getting into. If they haven't read it yet, we want to encourage them to do that. But for me, it jumped out right away because so we've read a lot of the Chronicles of Narnia together and those sorts of things. And so there is that one in Voyage of the Dawn Treader where you have Lucy and Edmund and Eustace all kind of going into a painting. So that was kind of what conjured up in my mind. But yeah, how did you come about deciding to make that a central part of the story?
Yeah, it's so funny. I've had so many people remind me of that moment, and that's my favorite of the Chronicles of Narnia. Yeah. But that I didn't consciously think of that when I was coming up with the idea. So where the idea originally came from was I was in a writing seminar about they were trying to get us to kind of mine our past, right? And they said, think about the most magical place from your childhood. And for me, that was my grandparents' house, and they were art collectors. And they had an art stuffed house like it is in the book. And they had an upstairs room that just had stacks of unused paintings. They didn't have room for them. And I thought, well, that would be an interesting place to start a story. Like what kind of character would need a story that was, related to art? And maybe what would, I love fantasy. Like I'm, very drawn to fantasy. So, there had to be a fantastical element. And so it just made sense that they would be able to go into the paintings. And so just my grandparents' house, shockingly enough, was the inspiration. But I'm sure, like Tolkien talks about the leaf mold of the mind. I'm sure Narnia was for sure in there percolating, and maybe the voyage was really an inspiration, but subconsciously, yeah.
No, that's awesome. That's great. So, and I'm sure you've had to answer this so much, right? You tell people you've written a book. So what is it about, right? And so how might you introduce our audience, for those that aren't familiar with this, the Beneath the Swirling Sky in particular, but the Restorationist series more broadly?
Yeah. So the Restorationists takes place in a world where art has power, paintings are portals, and one family must protect them. So Beneath the Swirling Sky starts out with Vincent. He's a 12-year-old kid and he's given up on art, which is really sad, right? But he then learns his family are the last Restorationists and have the ability to travel into paintings and the duty to protect them. So when his little sister gets lost in Van Gogh's Starry Night, he and his cousin Georgia are the only ones who can rescue her. So that one's out right now. And this fall, I think probably around the time this is releasing, September 2024, is when the second book comes out. It's called Between Flowers and Bones. And that one takes place through the first book, Vincent's the main character, and the second book, Georgia's actually the main character. It's a continuation of the story. Georgia's always thought she would be the very last restorationist. So she's really excited now that Vincent is joining the team. But somehow his gift makes her feel like a sidekick instead of a true team member. And so she is having to learn that every gift is important. And it goes through all new paintings that you get to enter and be introduced to. And there's always like an adventure story in relation to all of that as well.
That's excellent. Yeah, I was hoping that you would kind of just briefly introduce us to those main characters. Vincent, Georgia, Lily are all kind of the ones that get focused on here. And I actually think, and I've been thinking about this because so next school year we'll be doing art history with my son. And so I think it would actually be a neat kind of companion to something like that, because you could look at each of the paintings as they're mentioned in the story and then discuss some of the background, the artist, and those things while still kind of moving through the story. So I think that could be a really neat way to go through it. So I am curious with this second book. It sounds like we'll hear more about Georgia. We'll get to know Georgia more. Are there any other characters that we'll get to learn more about in this kind of second book?
Yes, we're going to have some more interactions with Ravi. And the lady will be back. I won't say any more about her since
Sure, yes.
if you haven't read book
No
one.
spoilers.
And then we'll get to briefly meet kind of the ultimate bad guy in the series, and he'll come more into play in book 3. That's what I'm currently working on finishing edits for.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
No, it's exciting. That's great. One of the things that I really appreciated about the book was looking at these, mostly the two, right? Vincent and Georgia, these cousins. One of them's homeschooled, which is kind of cool, just being in a homeschool family. But neither one was romanticized. Both of them were very real, and both of them were very flawed, but both show great virtue at different points in the story. And so it's almost like, and I appreciated this, but I kept waiting to see which one's the good one, right? Like which one's the one which one's the model, right? And neither one, what they were was just very real. They were what you would expect of kids, sometimes selfish, sometimes unfair. They would get mad at the other one for doing the exact same thing that and so it was neat to see that on display, and it almost created a tension because I wanted one of them to have all the right answers and all but I think there was greater value. So I don't know if maybe you could speak to that in the way that you crafted those characters.
Yeah, and I think for me, the Wingfeather Saga is a great model for how I wanted to portray characters as real and flawed and able to grow. And I know there's like so some Christian parents, like maybe they want books that are going to be like Pollyanna, where a character is just the role model, but I don't think that kids are able to really identify well with that, or they make comparisons and come out very negatively, and they don't see that as achievable. And so I wanted my characters to be real characters that struggled with real issues. I mean, if you think about like the characters we're given in the Bible, those are not perfect people either by any stretch. Most of them have quite a few flaws, and and they're either able to overcome it and be a positive example, or they don't, and they're a negative example. So I think we're definitely able to learn from either, and story is a great teacher in that way. So yeah, I wanted kids to be able to. I think we can trust kids to deal with real issues. I think they want to see real issues that they can grapple with in story and be challenged. I think that's what that really is what draws you into a story, right? More than just the plot or the fantastical element. Having real characters deal with real issues. I mean, C.S. Lewis lets his characters deal with big time sins sometimes, and make it through. So yeah, that was my goal.
That's excellent. And so that raises another question for me. So as somebody who, my area of research is the philosophy of art and beauty. And so that's where I spend most of my time thinking about. A close colleague of mine where I teach, who's also a Christian, is a filmmaker. And so we have lots of conversations about art and the way that maybe Christians can think about art, should think about art. And one of the things that I think can happen sometimes is that well-intentioned Christians produce propaganda. And so I thought you handled trying to produce something that I think one would say is explicitly Christian, but you didn't allow that to kind of slip into a kind of propaganda. The way that you brought faith into the story, I thought was really creative in itself. And so, not that every story needs to explicitly do that, but when you did, I thought it was a really intentional but very creative way of doing it. And so can you speak to that a little bit? How did you think through what kind of story you wanted to tell as a Christian while simultaneously still being true to the art form itself?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you. So probably so what's interesting is when I started writing this book, I had a different agent, was not actually even planning to submit to the Christian market. But as I started writing it, I mean, like, art is, part of art is that there's religious art. There's a lot of religious art, right? And that would be like really ridiculous to ignore in a book about art. And it's kind of a way for me to connect my Christianity with what I was writing. So I started writing this and thought, this is probably going to be too Christian for the regular market. Through a series of events, I ended up with a Christian agent, ended up at a Christian publisher, same publisher as Wingfeather Saga, actually. And I think maybe because I didn't set out writing it thinking that it had to hit these like certain markers as like a quote unquote Christian book, like the what you would think of. That probably helped, that it was just going to be like my faith was just going to come into it naturally. I feel like there's a lot of authors who are doing that even in the regular secular marketplace and doing an amazing job, like Matali Perkins or John Hendricks. So I kind of saw that as a model to be able to incorporate faith in a natural way. And then the big faith moment that you're talking about, which I won't spoil in the book, that I feel like God kind of dropped in my lap, because I constrained myself in the world to, which paintings I could use. They had to, the bad guys had to have paintings that are actual in real life stolen paintings, not recovered. And so that kind of dropped into my lap. But yeah, my goal is always to just incorporate things in a natural way and as part of the story, and not just kind of shoehorn faith into it to make, I don't know. So hopefully I'm successful in that in all the books. But yeah, that's definitely my goal when I'm writing, because I think faith is a natural element of our lives. I know kids in particular tend to be more open to faith topics, and belief. And So I thought art is a great way to introduce that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And again, I think it's a beautiful moment. And so again, if you haven't read it and you're watching this, go read it. Certainly don't want to ruin it, but I do think it stood out. And I think something that occurred to me that kind of, I think, emphasized that point is my niece, who I mentioned earlier. We've been going back and forth for weeks now, like comments and questions as we're kind of discussing the book. It's been neat. It's
That's awesome.
But one of her questions to me was, what do you think about the Jesus part, is what she said to me. And so, and that was the point that I made, that I thought it's not just that Jesus works his way into the story. It's how Jesus works his way into the story that I thought was so powerful. And so, yeah, I thought that was excellent. So I am curious, you've referenced Lewis. And so I think it's safe to say that's probably something we share in common, that he's shaped and maybe influenced the way that you think and the way that you think about stories and those sorts of things. He's been a huge influence in my life. And so one of the other worlds that I kind of participated in is in Christian apologetics. I do apologetics. I train people in apologetics and those kinds of things. And so all the rage for the past 10 years or so has been cultural apologetics, and Lewis and Tolkien are kind of the exemplars of cultural apologetics. And so as I'm thinking about your text, and I want to give you full freedom to say, like, no, that's not what I was doing. And so, I'm not one of the people who thinks like it is whatever you want it to be, right? Like, no, you tell me if I'm wrong here. But as I'm thinking through it, right, at least one of the aims of cultural apologetics would be to, in a world where people are largely apathetic about faith, it would be to push them to a point where they say, I don't know if Christianity is true, but I wish it was. And as I think about the Restorationists, who are, in a sense, restoring truth over and against a group that would distort the truth, I see that as the role of Christians being salt and light in the world. That this is so while somebody may say, man, I wish we could go into paintings, that would be awesome, that would be amazing, I wish this story were true, right? And I naturally think, I find myself like, man, that would be awesome. While we may not live in a world in which we can go into paintings, we do live in a world in which God has called people to be restorationists. Would you see your work as a kind of cultural apologetic in that way? That, in a sense, the magic of this story does align with the world we live in, and there is something for us to do in, that coincides with the story that you're telling.
That's a great question. I wasn't familiar with that term before, cultural apologetics. But I think I see story and art as something that can plant seeds. There's a great article by Matali Perkins. I think she wrote it for Christianity Today, and I read it maybe a decade ago, but it's like stuck with me how she didn't grow up as a Christian, but she read all of these, books like Narnia Chronicles and Secret Garden and all these like very Christian influenced works that she says planted seeds in her heart and made her, like you said, kind of wish for it to be true, even though maybe she didn't even know what it was at the time. So I see art and books and stories as able to do that, to plant those seeds. I don't think you're going to hand someone a book, a fiction book, and have them like have a come to Jesus moment necessarily. I think you need probably another person or the scripture to interact there. But I do see it as is something that can plant the seeds, and I am trying to write it in a way that it is true. And you're absolutely right. Like we are meant to restore and to beautify and to, you know, take our God-given roles seriously as you know, making the world a more beautiful place and a better place and more truthful place. So so yeah, I hope that kids kind of catch that vision and inspiration. When you're writing a story, though, it has to be the story, right? The story has to be king. So I don't know that I have like a specific goal other than to instill truth into the book, and hopefully that is what comes through when kids read it and are inspired.
So to go, kind of piggyback off of that, one of the things that I love, and I think it's a tension that Christian authors face, because like you said, truth matters, and truth is not divorced from art. I actually want to read a quote from your book here in a moment, but Lewis, Tolkien, G.K. Chesterton, who's one of my favorite authors, they will sometimes slip in through the mouths of their characters really profound statements that you could almost lift off of the story. And it's like, I remember reading, and my son had already finished the book, and I called him over, and I just appreciated it because I felt like it gave me words to express them. My kids know that dad's a professor. My kids know that dad talks a lot about art and all of these things, but I don't know that they still fully understand the way in which I see myself as missionally minded as a professor, and the things that I talk about is not merely because I think they're true, but because I actually think they're communicating truths about God's world to people and those sorts of things. So I called him over and I said, listen to this. And so I'll just read it to you briefly,
Okay.
and I'd love for you to comment on it. So it says, art expresses beauty and truth, Georgia said. It's a gift. It's meant to be experienced and interacted with, not used. That's what's so gross about what the distortionists do. They use art instead of making it or even enjoying it. They turn art into propaganda. So in what ways do you think that art brings us beauty and truth, or art communicates beauty and truth to us?
Gosh, it definitely depends on the piece of art, certainly. But I think the best art is seeking to capture the truth, right? The truth about the world we're in. Sometimes that means it's not beautiful if it's trying to capture a specific truth that's not beautiful. But yeah, I would say the best art is always trying to capture truth and or beauty. And as far as visual art, I think we have to slow down enough to see it, to really understand it, and to experience it. Yeah, I don't know if I have like a great way to put that into words,
Sure. Yeah.
because it is something that you have to experience with art. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have more
No,
to say on
that's
that.
great.
I mean, a lot of the book is me trying to explore what do I think about art and like
Right.
ask questions. Yeah, and I want to say that that it would be great if all art did really express beauty and truth.
Sure.
And obviously not all art does.
Right.
And when I was talking about the propaganda, I was specifically thinking a lot about you know, not like Nazi propaganda art. Kind of when I was writing the book or thinking about the book, I was listening to, I don't know if you're familiar with Vesper Stamper. She has a great podcast called Vesperisms. I don't think it's currently running anymore, but she talked a lot about art and propaganda and the kind of the difference between them. And definitely articulates a lot of it better than I can, but definitely influenced by her her thinking on that. But
Yeah. I appreciate it. For one, what it made me do. So one of the courses I teach is philosophy of art and beauty. And I wish Georgia was in my class, because oftentimes the way, and this isn't limited to my students, I think that many people, like, when I ask what is art, like, the answer is whatever you want it to be. Art is whatever you think it is. What is the meaning of art? It's whatever meaning you give it, right? So it's this idea that I, as the perceiver of the art, get to impose on it some kind of meaning, whatever, however it made me feel, or whatever the case is, or even reducing art to just generating feelings. And so I appreciated, and you chose Georgia to communicate those words, but for that to be in there also, because it's not just looking outward, oh, this is the way the world looks at art, but also this pushback against propaganda, which I think is something Christians have to be careful with, because it would also be problematic for us to, as I think with good intentions is oftentimes when it happens, but creating propaganda instead of art, I think is so the warning kind of goes in both directions, I think, of understanding art does have a purpose. Art is doing something. Goodness, truth, and beauty are all part of what art is doing or ought to be doing. But in contrast with propaganda and the way in which people tend to do that. And so
it's always easier to spot propaganda when it's the other side making it.
Yes. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, it is. It's much easier, because if it's what we agree with and just kind of, then we're a little more gracious maybe to it. But
I also think I don't know, like I will say, so since I came from picture books, back when I started writing picture books, they would say, like, it's a story, it shouldn't be sermonizing, it shouldn't have an agenda. And I feel like it's totally swung the other way, not just picture books, like all media, like all media seems to have an agenda now, whichever side it's on. And I feel like we're in a swing in our culture where much of what is created is propaganda, for one side or the other, right? Like, it's just.
So I had a conversation with an artist, and I won't say much to not give away who it is, because this was a conversation we had, in private. But they had listed something in their artist statement that I found odd. I just found it odd for them to feel the need to kind of give a disclaimer that they gave. And I asked this person, I said, why did you feel the need to give that disclaimer? And that person said, because I like to make pretty things. And in the art world today, simply making pretty things isn't enough. And so, and I think it's speaking to exactly what you're saying. Like, no, now art has to follow like the cultural orthodoxy. And if you're not pushing that particular agenda or whatever the case is, then it's not seen as being good art, which is ironic, because in some cases, those would have been the very same people that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago would say, you don't want to be so moralistic in art. You don't want to be preaching in art. But now that it's a different message, it's being received in a different way and almost expected now with a lot of the art that's out there. So, yeah, no, that's a great point. So as we kind of move our way towards the end here, what would you, for those who have read the book, and again, without necessarily spoiling anything for those who haven't, and again, we want to encourage, and I'll have links to where people can purchase the book and they can visit your website and those things. I'll have those in the comment below. When we release this episode, it'll be near the release, or at least the pre-order time for book 2. What can we look forward to? What would you encourage your current readers, the ones that have already read book 1, what kinds of things would you encourage them to look forward to in book 2 and 3 down the road?
Yeah. So it was kind of fun switching perspectives and having Georgia as the lead character for book 2. I think in book 1, she's someone who seems impressive, and maybe like you said, she definitely has her faults, but like, I think people would probably admire her more. And in book 2, since we're a little bit more in her perspective, she becomes someone you can actually identify with, right? And we can see who she is on the inside and what she struggles with, just like we saw with Vincent in book 1. And onward to book 3. That'll be the wrap up for the series. I'm not going to give away right now who the protagonist is for that one, but it'll be someone else. And I will say though, the chapter 1 of book 3 is included in the back of book 2. So
nice.
If people are curious, they can take a sneak peek once they finish book 2. But yeah, more adventure, more art. Yeah, some new characters in books 2
I'm
and 3.
curious, and it's okay if you can't say, but
Mm-hmm.
Van Gogh's work was, a big part of book 1. Is there another artist that is more prominent in book 2?
Yeah, so I would say the kind of featured artist in book 2 is Georgia O'Keeffe, who Georgia's named after, and so we probably have the most paintings, or most kind of lingering in her paintings, but there's several other artists in. It's funny because it's like I can't just pick my favorite artist because of the way the books work. The way they travel in paintings. I don't think I explained this to your audience, but basically if they enter a painting of a certain artist, they can get to any other painting of that artist and come out on the other side of the world. So I am kind of limited by, okay, well, what else is in that museum that they're at now? And how can they get somewhere else? And so I can't just like cherry pick my favorite artists as much as I would like to. I'm sticking by the rules of the book. So I learned a lot of stuff about artists I didn't really know much about, and got exposed to some new paintings that maybe someday I'll get to go see in person. I did get to do a research trip to New York City, and that came more into play for book 3, but a little bit for book 2. So I have seen a few paintings in person of these. And actually book 2, one of my local art museums, the McNay, is a spot. And so that was fun getting to add some local San Antonio flavor to book 2. That was a delight.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
One last question that occurred to me as you were speaking, because again, so G.K. Chesterton is huge. I did my dissertation on G.K. Chesterton and his philosophy of art. And so I'm reading Chesterton all the time. And he's a really interesting guy because he'll just randomly say like brilliant things in the midst of you weren't sure where he was going. And then, he says something. So, and he's got this kind of famous quote where he says that his favorite part of a painting is the frame. And what he's getting at there is that art needs to appreciate its limitations, right? That certain art forms are made for certain things, and that when an art form sees its appreciation, kind of like as human beings, when we understand that God's law is so that we could be more free, an artwork, when it appreciates its own limitations, is able to make more beautiful things. And so he's kind of getting at that idea of limitation. In the story, having a frame or not having a frame is significant. Is that just kind of something that you kind of thought of as you were, or is there something to that idea of a painting having a frame or not having a frame?
Man, I wish I had known that Chesterton quote and could have made it like more of a thing. No, it was more practicality, actually, because if all the paintings could be traveled through at any moment, you could never hang anything on any wall, right? Like you could, anyone could come into, the bad guys could come at any moment if you didn't have a way to keep them out by taking the frame off the painting. So, that was more of a story reason than a philosophical one, but I'm definitely gonna look up that Chesterton quote.
Awesome. Well, Carolyn, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Again, for those who have listened and watched, I really want to encourage you to pick up this book. I think those that are part of this community, those that watch the content that I make, it is very much in line with the things that we appreciate. And so, again, I want to encourage everyone to get Beneath the Swirling Sky. Again, regardless of age, I think it's just a great book. And yeah, to go ahead and pre-order book 2 as well.
Thank you so much. I
Absolutely.
appreciate that. I hope everybody enjoys it.